All right, howdy, folks. I think we are live and good to go. My name is Chris. I am going to be interviewing for the second interview Bishop Ron Shelton. He was the person who brought me into the Celtic Church in our first one, which you can find in our YouTube live archives. Um, you can hear us talk a little bit about the Celtic Church. Bishop Ron talked about the way of life and kind of how the church is focused on simplicity and values education. We talked about the connection to nature. We talked about thin places. We talked a little bit about sacramental living and what that means. Um, and so, we kind of broke this idea of like what is the Celtic Church up into three big categories. The first one was the way of life. The second one is Celtic theology, and the third one is liturgical practice. And so, in the first one, we talked about the way of life, and today's session is going to focus in on Celtic theology. So, with all that being said, I'll give Ron here a moment to introduce himself and share. Is there anything you want to say as we jump into this?
I just want to welcome everybody. If you have questions, just reach out to Chris and send those questions to him, and we'll try to answer. You'll find one of the things is that in the Celtic history of the Celtic faith, a lot of these traditions are handed down orally, so they're repeated time and time again. In fact, before I was made a bishop, I sat with a bishop that consecrated me in his home, and he told the stories over and over. And every week we met, we'd go back over those same stories, and every story explains something. So it's very important that I will, when we begin, start kind of going back over again, and then bring you into today's lessons. I may not fully get where I want to go, but I've got some thoughts on my mind that I want to share with you. So, Chris, is there anything else you need me to do before I get started?
No, as I hear you talking, get started. It sounds like you've got some specific things planned, and I know I've got some questions.
Mm.
So how do you want to roll with this? Do you want to do kind of a presentation first, and then we jump into questions, or do you want me to start with questions and we'll see where that goes? Or
Let me do a little bit of an introduction about the history of how we've got to where we are right now. Just a very basic, simple. I'm going to be talking about that in particular, and may pick it up in the next one too, and talk about another group that we are a descendant of, and to give you that way you kind of understand where we're coming from. And so, with that in mind, go ahead and let me go through it, and then it may bring up other questions, and it may then have a time for you to ask me questions, and I can try to answer. Because theology-wise, I've not that really going to dive into it that much, but some of it may come up in what I'm talking about. So,
okay,
all right. I want to go back over one thing. When I say the word Celtic Church, as we're looking back in history of the Celtic faith, I'm talking about Britain, which would be called England, Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and Ireland, being the Britannic Isles, the Celtic nations. And so when I talk about the Celtic Church in the past, that's where I'm talking about. But also the Gallican Church in France, which was most of France, the Gallican Church there was Celtic in its origin. Also, the Bobbio Church in northern Italy is of Celtic origin. And there's another group, and I can't remember the name they go by, in Spain that was heavily Celtic influence. So those are kind of give you an idea of the different places we come from. But I want to also go back over that the Celtics in the Britannic Isles, they were tribal, clannish. And so their churches were based upon their tribe or their clan. And with that in mind, that influenced a lot of the ways these particular groups developed, whether it's in Wales, whether it's in Scotland, or Cornwall, or Ireland, etc. They developed differently. Now, most of our history comes from Scotland due to the history of our particular group, which was the Celtic Church of Scotland, that we are the granddaughter of that group. Uh, and I'll give you a couple of dates, and I will tell you the research that I have found. And anything that I try to do, I go and try to footnote everything. I try to find as much information as I can, dates, names, places, because you can go back and verify. And I'm just always been like that. That's just the historical history part of, I love history. So if something's going on, I try to date it, pinpoint it, etc., locations, etc. In 1932, the story is told that there was three young gentlemen. At one time, I'd been told they were Catholic priests, but come to find out they were not Catholic priests. They were Catholic of their faith, and they had been exposed to. There was a revival of everything Celtic, which was happening in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and they had been exposed to that, and they were of Highland Scot descendants, I guess you would say. So in 1932, the three of them went into the Highlands. And if you go back to the 1930s, 1940s, and even the 1950s, to get into the Highlands of Scotland, it would take a long period of time to get there. The roads were not like they are today. You get on the M9 now, and you can shoot all the way up into the Highlands of Scotland and be there lickety-split. But back then, it took a great amount of time. And what they were searching for is they'd been told stories by their parents and their grandparents about this Celtic faith, and they'd read about it and it interested them. And so all three of them, one was by the name of William Mackenzie, that I've been able to find out his last name. And if you pop that first picture up, Chris, as the older gentleman, the one on, it'd be on my left, that is William Mackenzie when he was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. That was him taken outside of the, and we'd call them nursing homes in America. They don't call them nursing homes there. They have another name for them, where he was taken care of. He was the last survivor of that group of three that went into the Highlands. His family was originally from Inverness, which is a town within the Highland area, and they were Mackenzies, very heavily, as I said, tribes. He went in there with two other guys. One was named Rory, Rory. I've never been able to find out his last name. And then there was an individual by the name of David. They were in their late 20s, early 20s, somewhere in that area there. And they was trying to do research. They had read several articles and books about the Celtic faith, the Highlands of Scotland, the faith of the Highlands people. And they had all been influenced, and they'd been driven out of the Highlands, actually their families had, by the Highland clearances. And if you don't know anything about the Highland clearances, they were a very rough time. This was not just where you got evicted from the home you got, and you got in your car and loaded your stuff up and you drove to go find another place. They were actually burned out of their homes. Their livestock was either stolen or destroyed, killed. Their food supplies were destroyed. They were thrown out of their house with nothing on but what they could carry. And it was very traumatic for the Highland Scots, these Highland clearances. And they've been handed down through their families for generations. The terror, the deaths that took place of elderly people that would die, they starved to death. A lot of the Scots from the Western North Carolina area and the mountains here in our area are descended from these Highland Scots that came during these Highland clearances. They came to America during that time period. So it was a very traumatic time. But these gentlemen wanted to find out this faith and find out about the history of their people. And so when they got up in the Highlands, they spent many years. And I don't know what happened to the other two gentlemen, but William Mackenzie in 1978 was living in what would be called a pauper's home, where he had no way of supporting himself, and he was elderly, and he thought he was going to die. He really did. He thought he was dying. And they reached out to a young Catholic priest by the name of David Stalker, and had him come. And I'm not sure whether he's going to give last rites to the individual or what he was going to do. But when he arrived there, got up a conversation with William and began to find out about his history and where he was from and some of the things that he'd done. And it intrigued David Stalker. So he asked him more questions and kept asking more questions. And before long, it became apparent that what he was talking about interested David Stalker, who was a priest at that time. And he kept asking questions and kept learning. And they had a good, long relationship until about 1982 when William finally died. And he handed that mantle off to him of what the Celtic Church was all about, or the Celtic faith. And it really took hold in Stalker, who later was consecrated bishop. And if you know anything about the Highland Scots or the Celtic Church itself, they didn't call together and have 5 or 6 bishops lay hands on somebody. you would have whoever the bishop was at that time would lay hands upon the individual becoming the next bishop. And that was the way it was passed on. And so that faith, the beliefs were passed on to him. And he began telling about certain writings for him to read. He got him in contact with people that might be able to tell him a little bit more. So the Celtic Church in Scotland was born out of that chance meeting between who would become known as Bishop David Stalker, who is the second person in the picture there in the center. And then we have Bishop Gillies. All three of these are now passed away. William McKenzie sometime in the, I think 82 to 84, sometime in that period. Stalker passed away in 2010. Bishop Gillies, who's on the far right there, he passed away just this past year. And he actually lived in Wales. So this is our history that our particular group has, from William McKenzie to David Stalker, Gillies. And if you put up the next picture, which is the Mother Kirk. This here is a very old church, but down below it there's a Celtic cross, and I believe you can barely make it out. I believe it's behind these individuals here, off to the what would be my left, where the guy wearing the brown overlay is standing. There's a Celtic cross that marks the spot where the ancient church used to stand, that was made of wood, which they had done archaeological digs. And the Celtic Church of Scotland was actually responsible for keeping and maintaining this facility until very recently, within the past 4 or 5 years. So this was the Mother Kirk, where everybody went to be consecrated, ordained, etc. And the individual on the right is Bishop Dillard, who was the bishop that consecrated me. And I just wanted to put some pictures, some faces with some names, so people could see these individuals and go from there. Now, one of the things I've learned is that there are actually 4 pillars that support the Celtic Church. And I say support, it's kind of like 4 statements or 4, and I'll just throw them out to you. One is love, and it's based on Jesus loving people, loving individuals, loving people where they are, reaching out to people where they are, what they need, encouraging them, helping them to find those inner abilities that they have and the strengths that they have, that they can help other people. That's really what being Celtic really is. We all have that desire within us to help other people, and the Celtic faith especially, it's like it's something inside of you pushes you to want to help other people and encourage other people. So there's the pillar of love. We need to love one another. Then there's the pillar of humility. And I'm reminded how Christ, when the disciples were there in the upper room, how he took a towel and girded himself and began to wash their feet. One of the things you learn about Celtic bishops is we don't have this gold and all this fanciful stuff. It's very simple, very simplistic. It's about being a servant to others. That's really what being a bishop is all about. You are a servant to the other people, the people that come in contact with you, that you see day to day. So there's the part of humility. Then there is compassion. And I'm reminded how Christ, as he's coming down off the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, he looked out towards the Jerusalem and he wept, and he said, how often would I wanted to gather you together as a mother hen does her little chicks, but you would not. So there's a part of compassion. And I believe that's missing today in our society and in the times that we're living is compassion. We need to have compassion for each other. And that compassion, and I thought just come to my mind as I was thinking, our forgiveness is based upon us being willing to forgive. Now, that's a hard subject sometimes to take, but if we can't forgive others, how can we expect to be forgiven? We have to be willing to forgive others that have wronged us, done things against us. We have to have that compassion to see the needs of the people. I've always thought, why do people go to foreign lands and just preach when you need to help them where they're at? If they're hungry, you need to teach them how to grow crops. If they need water, you need to help them build a well. Why? Because we need to meet the physical as well as the spiritual needs that people have. So we need to have compassion. That's one of these 4 pillars. The last one is forgiveness. To forgive others as they forgive us. And Jesus on the cross said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So the ultimate forgiveness If Christ can forgive those that were crucified, and I can surely forgive anybody, anything else that may come against me or may happen because of somebody else, I can forgive. And so these are 4 pillars, I call them, that really undergird and support the Celtic faith itself. And Abbot McRae, I haven't mentioned him very much in our talks, I don't believe. Probably the next one I'll talk more about him. His group came over to America during the Highland clearances. His family was driven off the land because they were not loyal to the crown. Not only were they not loyal to the crown, but they were not loyal to the local church in Scotland because they practiced this Celtic faith, which you could be at home, you could be sitting in the meadow, you could be tending the sheep, you could be whatever you might be doing. This faith was living within you at that wherever you were. You didn't have to be in a church building. So they came over to America and end up settling in upstate New York. So probably the next time I'll mention something about them and have some pictures of our 2 trips we were able to make and be among them. And he came to visit us. I think it was 3 different times he actually came down to our location in Western North Carolina, right outside of Asheville, and spent time with us and told us stories. And it was really very interesting times. So we have the 4 pillars. But then I want to talk about what I think is, I'm looking over my notes that I've kind of written down here. One of the thoughts I want to share with you is what is wrong with evangelical Christianity today is all they want to talk about is the future. They want to talk about that happy place we're going to go to. And there's nothing, don't get me wrong. I don't want to sound like I don't agree with that, but it's all they focus on is the future, the future, the future. Well, the Celtic faith is about living now. It's about living among the people now. It's about helping them, reaching them, encouraging them now. I believe that's what Jesus taught, how to live now, how to mirror, how to be that likeness, that image of Christ. We are his hands and his feet. That's one thing Bishop Dillard always says in every one of his homilies, every one of his talks, that we are Christ's hands and feet on this earth now, and we need to be a reflection of what Christ would do if he was here and how he would interact with the people. And we see that in the Gospels. Also, one thing I wanted to point out too is that the Celtic Church, or the Celtic churches, I say churches plural, in the Britannic Isles, the Gospels was the most important part of the scriptures that they had. They didn't have all these other writings, but the Gospels were very important, especially the Gospel of John seems to be the most prominent gospel being used by these early Celtic believers. And even today, we are encouraged, and we encourage our priests and our bishops that their homilies that they're going to give, that they would take them from the Gospels. Talk about the examples of Christ and his disciples. What else do I want to talk about? The church in Italy was called the Bobbio Church. The Gallican Church has its liturgy, and it's there now. There's several books been written about it. You can go and research. The Britannic Isles, the Celtic Church there. There's pieces of their liturgies that we find in different places. Somebody will point out the Book of Deer, some of the other books that have liturgies within them, or parts of liturgies, prayers, etc. You'll find out they have been heavily redacted, heavily influenced by external influences outside of the Celtic faith, have influenced those writings themselves. Also, let's talk about the governmental structure. And I hate to use the word governmental structure, but the structure of this Celtic belief system in Wales, in Scotland, somewhat in Cornwall. It was based around the monastery, a monastic type system set up where you had an abbot who was in charge, who would send out individuals into different areas you would have like a mother church or a mother monastery, for lack of a better term. And they would send out individuals that would go out to different areas. And usually it was within a tribal area, and they developed chapels, oratories, as they became known later. And you still find a lot of those old rundown locations where all that's left is some of the foundation walls in Wales and even in Scotland. There's a very good book called The Secret Church. And it's not some secret hush-hush secret, but it's ancient churches that stood throughout the Britannic Isles that you can go and find the remnants for them. One thing that I just find fascinating is the history of these local churches, how they developed. They call them the saints, how the saints would travel and they would bring these groups together. Last time we talked about, one thing I want to mention is we talked about the thin places, these spiritual places where people can go to. Sometimes they're designated places that have been forever, and then sometimes you can go and you can make your own spiritual place. Abbott McRae would talk about that a lot, how the blessing of the space. And in Wales, when you would develop want to build a monastery, it seems that the number 12 was always used, 12 or 14 hides of land, which was a measuring system at that time. And so whoever was established in that monastic location would spend their time walking the property and praying and doing it in a cycle to where they'd pray, quote scripture, pray, quote scripture, pray, quote scripture, because they was designating that land as a special place where individuals, families could come and they would be introduced to what it was to be in the way, the followers of the truth, the followers of the way itself. Let's see, let me make a few more comments here. I said last time is based on the tribal system. That is the hardest thing for us in America to understand, is the tribal or the clan system. We don't get it. But in Scotland, even today, it's still very strong. In Wales, it's still very strong, even today. To the older people, now the younger people, they're not. Just like here in America, the younger people today they've grown disheartened by what they see as being religion, how religion has acted and how people have done or how people do things. And it's caused the younger generation to say, I don't want nothing to do with that. So there's still the older generations in Scotland and in Wales where the tribal system or the clan system is still very strong within them. And it's unusual because us America, we don't have that. Now we do have some of us do have our extended families, but it's not like it was there. They were strong. It was, you belong to the tribe, you belong to the land. It was the tribe itself that owned the land. It wasn't the individuals. And it's just totally different understanding of the tribal system. And that influenced how this Celtic faith developed. This tribal system really influenced it. The Celtic saints, if you want to read some of the stories of the Celtic saints, I believe one of the books is written by a name named Jocelyn. I may be mispronouncing the name. It was written in the very early days about the early saints, and it's really a very good book. And it helps, as you read it, you begin to understand why they did some of the things that they did, why they built these churches in certain areas. You go over there now and you will find wherever there was an oak grove, when the area became, I'll just call it Christianized, when the tribe or the people began to accept the Christian beliefs, they would take that oak grove and they would build a sanctuary there, a place where the tribe would come together to receive, and it became a church locations. And how many of these old church buildings can be traced back to those early days of the tribal system in 100, 200 AD earlier can be traced back to that, even into the BC time periods. That area has long been held as a sacred place. There were sacred wells, there were sacred groves of trees, sacred streams, places where miracles had transpired were considered sacred. There's all these sacred places. Somebody said if you took all the sacred places in the British Isles and try to put them in a book, you'd have you remember how the old encyclopedias used to be? You'd have 32 of them, and they'd be about as thick and small print you could barely read. They say that's how many of these holy sites they would be in the British Isles, because every place was sacred and had some significance in itself. The Episcopal system in the Celtic Church is a lot different than other groups. Let me just talk about that just for a few minutes. The Episcopal system in the Celtic Church they're not lords, they're servants. They are spiritual directors, for lack of a better term, spiritual guides that would guide people. They were servants to the people, but these men and women that were served and led in the Celtic faith. It was a very simple form of fashion, of a liturgy, very simple form of dress, very simple form of their how they would teach. I mentioned earlier how stories are told over and over and over and over and over, and it was really evident with Bishop Stalker. Being Scottish, I couldn't sometimes make out what he'd be saying because the heavy, just the Scottish brogue, I guess you'd call it, the speech itself. And Abbot McCrae from upstate New York, he would start off telling the story and then go to another story, then go to another story, and then go to another story, and then come all the way back to this first story and finish whatever he's talking about. And every time he'd come together, he'd do the same principle. And I found that even Bishop Dillard would pick it up, where he would begin telling a story. And by the time he get done, I would have 100 some questions, because they would be little stories within how you got from point A to point Z. And it just the repetition of telling these stories and telling these stories and telling these stories. And they all have significance. Even the life of the Celtic saints, as you read them, their lives, or the writings of their lives, are telling a story for us to have understanding and to ask questions. Chris, feel free to jump in there and kind of give it a little bit of direction. Let me mention 4 things I want to talk about in the future. I don't know when I'll get to those. I want to talk about the structure of these monasteries and the structure of the churches that later developed. I want to talk about the liturgy a little bit. I want to talk about the faith itself, or the spirit of the faith. It's the spirit of simplicity, the spirit of being one with nature, the spirit of that we were all created, and we all have a spark of God within us. It's like painting a painting. When you paint a picture or you draw something, you put yourself into it. And the Celtic people believe that when God created us, nature, the animals, the trees, the land, everything, he put himself into it. And that's how come the earth now groans, it says, groans with anticipation for that time when we will once again return to that special time when there was no sin, there was no death, there was no destruction. And I also want to talk about a group you may never heard about called the Chaldees. I refer to the group as the Chaldees, but people call them the Chaldees. I'll talk about them at a later time too, because that's a very important teaching within itself and a study there. Chris, you got any questions for me? I've kind of
so many
broad range.
so many.
Just start down your list.
So let me start with you were talking about the 4 pillars, and I caught love, humility, compassion. What was the 4th?
Forgiveness.
Could you? I could have totally spaced, and maybe you talked about it, but could you just briefly talk about that one, since I missed it? Forgiveness
is being able to forgive others, and for us to be forgiven ourselves. My mind just went blank. Sometimes that happens as we get older. But the part where the Lord's Prayer, or the prayer that was taught to the disciples.
Yeah, you did talk about that briefly, because you were talking about how the forgiveness is dependent on how we forgive others.
Yes, and a lot of people don't realize that, and they say, "Well, I might forgive you, but I won't forget." That's to me telling me there's no forgiveness. We've got to be willing to forgive. And the Celtic people were very forgiving people, but at the same time, I've met a lot of Scottish people, and Abbot McCrae was one of them. And he'd talk about battles that took place in the 1500s, 1600s, like it was yesterday. He wouldn't go eat at McDonald's. And I say that because the name McDonald's so turned him off because of what had happened to his family. But I don't want to get to that. I want to say this. We have to be willing to forgive when people do things against us. Things happen in life, and we can become bitter. We can become hard and callous. But these 4 pillars, I think that's the thing that we're taught, is not to become hard and callous, not to become critical, but to continue to love and continue to have compassion. Everybody makes mistakes, and we do too. And we've got to not only forgive, but we got to ask for forgiveness. And so these four pillars are what was handed down to me that are kind of the core belief system of the Celtic faith itself.
It's interesting as you talk about this idea of forgiveness, and it strikes me that when we're not living in forgiveness, that there's a part of us that's living in the past, because we're dwelling on that thing that happened, right? And so we're dwelling on the past instead of being in the present. And you talked a little bit about how being in the present is a piece of Celtic focus, right? Could you talk more about that? Like how do we focus on the present? How is that a practice among the Celtic Church?
That could be through works of ministry. And I'm just going to throw out some things here. You might have a local school that has a kindergarten or preschool where they come from a poor background. The parents are doing all they can to put food on the table. And your group in your area could work with others and get backpacks with school supplies put in them, give them to that local school to give to those kids. That is a ministry of compassion and caring and living in the now. Also, during the summer months, most kids, I know in Western North Carolina, most of the children don't get no lunch. They come from very poor families. And during the school year, they're fed lunch. But once school's out, they're not. You could do stuff like that. You could have welcome tables where people can come in and eat that might not be getting a good meal. You can provide clothing, and I'm talking about the now. Because how can we tell people about heaven and about God and that God loves them and God cares about them when we're not doing nothing to demonstrate that? It's like going to a person that's done something wrong, smacking them upside the head and saying, "You better do better," and not tell them how to do better. Or you better stop doing that. Well, I've always done that. We've got to live now. That's the Celtic faith, is demonstrating the love of God in action. And it's not just saying words from a pulpit or from a church. It's getting outside those four walls and doing something in the community that has a meaning to the people. It's like taking to homeless people little packages of shampoo and toothpaste and shaving creams, things like that, giving it to them. Somebody said, "Well, they're just homeless." We don't worry about that. We're trying to find. Well, you can tell them where they can go to get help. You try to help them. You can give them. It's showing that compassion that we really care. And I know right now in West North Carolina, homelessness is one of the biggest. It's humongous. It is so huge. I don't know about your area you're in, Chris, but here it's really big, and there's a lot of homeless people. And there's so much that we can do, but we need to be demonstrating. That's really what it boils down to, being now, right now. Not talking about what's going to happen in the future. Let's do it now. Let's, if we know a neighbor, something just come to mind. There's a gentleman that lived near where we lived 4 or 5 years ago when I lived beside my parents. And there's times he didn't have that much food to eat. And every time we'd have a get together at our house, I would take him a plate of food over to him. Whether it be hot dogs, hamburger, it didn't matter. He'd eat it, and he loved it. And he was always, he'd have you come and say he's just a nice person, but he just didn't have it like everybody else did. And so by demonstrating that love, now we all have our faults and our failures, but we need to be known for loving people. We need to be known for showing compassion to people. And that's living in the now. It's one thing to stand there and wag your finger and say, "God said you need to," no, demonstrate it. Show me what Christ would do.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of answered that.
It does. It strikes me. So as a spiritual director, I spend a lot of time helping people practice the now. But often that comes in the term in centering prayer and breath practice, and maybe even meditating walks. And it's almost a way to turn inward. And what strikes me about the way that you talk about the Celtic practice of now is it's an outward practice. It's an outward focus.
I'll say this: what is on the inside will come to the outside. If you are really a follower of Christ, it will take action. Now, some people are kind of quiet. Here in West North Carolina, we say they're backward. That means they just don't like to get out in front of people and do things. But there's little things everybody does. And so whatever's on the inside, it will come out. It will be demonstrated. Now, if you can get two people in a room and have three different opinions on anything. You can have a family. It can be a work environment. It can be a school environment. We're going to see each other's flaws, yes. But overall, they ought to be able to say when our crossing time comes, our passing, when we put off this and that spark of God is within us, we return back to God. They should be able to say, he showed compassion. He showed love. He demonstrated forgiveness. All these things are things that need to be demonstrated to people, because people are hard right now. Times are hard. People are hard, not just in the religious realm, but in the political realm and just the day-to-day living. People are hard, and it's some difficult times that we're living in right now.
Yeah. Another thing that you brought up that I thought was worth exploring a little deeper, you talked about how the homilies come from the Gospels. Mm-hmm. And in particular, you mentioned that the Gospel of John is kind of favored. I wonder if you could talk about what is it about the Gospel of John?
The Gospel of John throughout it is, I would refer to it as the love gospel. The disciple whom Jesus loved. The disciple whom throughout talks about love and talks about these four pillars a lot. It just seems to be a favorite. I just think it's the way it reads itself, just what it says and how the actions of Christ and his disciples throughout the Gospel of John are reflecting love. Now, there are some areas where it's not as reflective, but overall, now my favorite gospel is the Gospel of Mark. I love the Gospel of Mark. The straightforwardness, the action that's happening, and the same way with John, it demonstrates what's happening, and it's more of the Gospel of John is kind of a mystical gospel in a sense, very mystical in its presentation, and raises a lot of questions as we read the Gospel of John. When I do a study, I just go down as I'm reading verses, and if something pops up in my head, I make a little note. In fact, I have all these notebooks that I keep where it's a mess, and I'll be honest with you, it's a mess, but I just jot down notes, and whatever I'm studying on, I can go back. I've got these notebooks going back several years, and I can pull them out, and you can see what I was studying about during the month of June, July, and August, or whatever it was. And when they get full, I just fold them up, put them aside, and sometimes they pick them back up and go back through them and open them up and begin to look at them. But I love the Gospel of Mark, but the Gospel of John, we find more references to the Gospel of John and some of the Gaelic writings that are available. That's when I say the Gospel of John seems to be the most prevalent of all of them, just because we find more of it being quoted, references being made to it. So it seems to be one of the most popular, I would say, among them.
Yeah.
Now, the early Celtic people were not as fortunate as us. We have the scriptures that we can just flip through and read. Stuff to them. There was a battle fought over it. There was Columba, if I remember the story correctly, he copied one of these writings, and he took it and didn't want to give it back, and he caused the war. And he was actually on the side of the non-Christians, and they went into battle, and a lot of his kinfolks, the people of his tribe, were killed because of his. That just shows humanity, who we are. And he was actually made to leave Ireland and went to Iona, and that's where he set up the monastery there. Just close enough where he could look off in the far distance and see Ireland. That was his home. But yeah, there's actually a battle fought over copying that particular book, and the lawyerly class of the people ruled that to the cow belongs the calf. And so to the one that owns the original writing, this other writing that you copied also belongs to them because it's from them. That kind of a concept. So it's interesting. And if you look at a lot of the old Celtic writings, they're very colorful. I mean, they're very artistic, very beautiful done, very beautiful binding. I mean, and it took time to put all this together. These monasteries where they write and write and copy and copy and write and write and write, very beautiful works are still survive, still survive.
Yeah. You glossed right over this point, and I know from personal experience with you and with the church how important it is. So I just want to pause with it. You talked about men and women in the ministry, and the Celtic Church has a real rich history of men and women in ministry, and it predates a lot of places having that. And so I wonder if you could just talk about that for a moment.
I'll throw a little bit out here. Abbot McRae does not like the writings of Paul, and a lot of Celtic people anciently didn't like Paul's writings. They for various reasons. But one thing Paul said, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, bond or free, male or female. And the Celtic Church lived that. There was no difference between a male and female, bond or slave, or bond or free, Gentile or a Jew. And so if you go back and look at the early history, many times there were women that held places of authority within the tribe. The Celtic people were the first people that would allow for a woman to divorce her husband. Now, you have to get into a lot of study about that because there's various reasons given. But so women were able to be leaders, warriors. They were able is very different understanding of the husband and wife family relationship was different than what we understand today. So definitely women held positions of authority. And so for us here within the Celtic Church now, we have no problem with women having positions of authority. In fact, we believe it shows that the church or the local group has evolved to where we should be. So when I look at that, I look at it from the standpoint of neither male nor female. God uses everybody. God gives us all gifts. God gives us all abilities. One thing about being a bishop is when you're choosing a bishop, you need to choose people or begin to look for certain qualities of people that God will stand out in when you're looking at these individuals. They need to be people that are not promoting self, but promote others, that are able to see the abilities of people, not just that could be, may not be now, but could be. And so I think that's very important, that as the leadership of the Celtic faith, that we strive to see what God sees with each individual. I believe when God looks at us, he sees individuals who have abilities and talents that can do humongous things. I mean, can do great things if given the right push, the right encouragement. Great things can happen. I can remember my first supervisor position I ever got, which was outside the church religious world, but it was a good thing because I told the group when I first went in, they went through a tumultuous time, and man, it was just a bad department. And I said, I'll make sure you got the training, the time, and the tools to do the job you need to do. That's really what being a Celtic bishop's all about, making sure people have the understanding, the knowledge, that they have the time to do what they need to do, and that we're going to help them do it. And if we have to come alongside of you and help, that's what we're willing to do. It makes a difference. And that's why I believe you've always been such a good fit into the Celtic faith itself, because you've demonstrated since the early days. And I told you a long time ago, if you remember, I kept saying, you're going to be a leader in our church someday, because you were exhibiting this humbleness, you were quiet. You didn't say very much. In fact, sometimes I had to almost reach in there and grab it and pull it out and get you to tell me what you was thinking or what was going on. But you demonstrated that you asked the questions. You saw things people didn't see. And that's what the Celtic faith is about: seeing things that aren't there that can be there.
Yeah. Thank you. You do me a great kindness. So this the next questions are kind of shifting away from the presentation, and kind of touching on some other things that I think are important for us to cover. Um, when I first started, one of the things that I heard you say that struck me, it's so similar to other churches' phrases, this in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things love.
Yeah, I believe the Episcopal Church really uses that very strongly. But that was something that had been somehow ingrained into me. I was not raised to be open-minded, and I was raised very, 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 for lack of a better term, right-wing conservative. And so, if you come from a religious background in that area, you know what I'm talking about. But I'm thankful that God spoke to me and allowed things to happen in my life that showed me that compassion was needed, that forgiveness was needed, that love was needed, understanding was needed, that people sometimes done things they did because they didn't know any better. So I was thankful for those things. But we have the hardest thing, I believe, for all of us is to forgive ourselves. There's a lot in that. There's a lot in that statement, to forgive yourself. Every day that we live, the enemy, sometimes it's self, tries to bring up and remind us of the things that we've done that were wrong, the times we failed, the times we didn't do what should have been done, and we'll continue to remind about that. And we've got to be able to forgive ourselves before we can forgive others. It's there's a lot of weight in that statement that I can't even begin to fathom. To me, it's like looking in a deep well. Uh, you know, we have to be able to do it.
I've started to refer to this this phrase, that in essentials unity and non-essentials liberty and all things love, and maybe this broader aspect of it, I started to refer to as generous orthodoxy, and
Yes.
and by that I mean, like, it's ridiculous how many people belong here and that it's okay. Like, the differences in opinions and theology, and y'all used to tell me stories about, I think it was St. Patrick, you said, would beat somebody to death with his crozier. There's a lot of arguments among the early Irish bishops, but there was almost this in the early synods and stuff like that I was a part of. There was this encouragement to disagree, this encouragement towards argument, and this overall belief that just everybody gets to play, everybody gets it.
That's what's wrong today. We cannot agree to disagree. Whether it's in the political realm, the religious realm, wherever it is, we cannot agree to disagree. It seems that all we can do is begin to throw out names and call each other names. And if you look back in the history of Christianity, there are synods there where the Saint Nicholas, who is where we get Santa Claus from, he was the one that took his crozier and almost beat another bishop to death because he didn't agree with him. This is the man that Santa Claus is based upon. You know what I'm saying? So you got to think about these things. There are all these instances where you can read where there were such strong disagreements, anger, but we've got to agree to disagree. There's nothing wrong with allowing somebody to state their opinion. In fact, in our synods that we had, we kind of encouraged that. There were times when new people would come in just to see, here's the best way to find out how people think. Give them a situation, give them some thoughts or something like that. Just stick it to them and let's see how they respond. Let's see how they take and deal with this, whatever it may be. Whatever we could be talking about. And when you were part of our, and I've done that quite a bit, I would just throw stuff out because I wanted to learn how they thought about processes and how they got their conclusion. That makes me think. I read a lot of books and listen to lectures by individuals that I really don't agree with. But I listen because I was taught a long time ago uh, that to understand how somebody gets their answer, I got to know what the problem is that they're trying to solve. And so, therefore, I read and I want to see, it's like a mathematical equation. I want to see how they got their answer so I can understand how they got it. So then I can process it and begin to sit down and talk to them about whatever it may be that we may disagree on, and throw it out there and deal with it and learn and get them to tell me why they believe something. Don't just say, well, it's because that's what I've always been done. It's the way we've always done it. It's what we're always going to do. No, explain to me why or why not. And that's been demonstrated a lot. And I'll throw this out. Bishop Lyle was one in the early days that when he was coming to the church, I threw a lot out at him because I want to see how he thought about things. And I was convinced in the early days, and if he can remember back and tell you this, I told him he was going to be a leader in the church. And he kind of, oh yeah, it's Ron. He's crazy. He lets anybody come in and be part, all this kind of stuff. But you see things in people, and you see their abilities and their talents, and that's one reason why when I came down time to retire, I was happy to retire. Let somebody else take, not just because it was very emotional and it took a lot out of you, but because they could begin to take a position where they could begin to lead people and demonstrate. And I'm already praying and looking to the next bishop who's going to be the leader in our church. Not Lyle, you don't need to go nowhere. I'm not saying that, but because you've got to be preparing, you got to be thinking about that for us to continue. There is I can't remember. I want to say an old Star Trek episode. And I know this sounds crazy, but in that episode, there was this religious group. I can't remember what group it was exactly, that had a very ancient history going way back. And during this episode, little bits and pieces of it come out in the episode. Well, the same way with our faith. If our faith is going to survive, we have to be training men and women that can take our place and be willing to let them take our place and encourage them and give them all the time, the training, the tools to do it, and stick them out there. And then not just say, oh, we ain't going to do it, we ain't going to help them, but no, keep on encouraging them and keep on helping them. That is why the Celtic faith has survived, because we what's the word I'm looking for? We invest in people's lives. We invest in different situations. We put our time and our abilities, and we invest in people. It's just like a company does. The Celtic faith, I hate to use the word company, but companies that you work for, they invest in you for training. The same thing, Chris, back in your early days, investing. Now, might not always been the best investment or the way it should have been, but I was trying to put something there that I knew I knew it. I knew eventually you'd come back around. I knew that. People say, how do you know? I don't know that. And Bishop Diller was the same way. He used to tell me you can tell people that have those gifts and abilities within them, and you just kind of feed them, not overwhelm them, but just keep giving them a little bit. Keep them, even when they say, there ain't nothing I can do. I'm gonna leave the Celtic Church. I'm just don't worry about it. God's got a purpose for you. We're going to stay in contact with you. We're going to keep encouraging you. Write that book. Write that story. Write that whatever it may be. Present those homilies, because you have a gift within you, and we're going to encourage you to do that. And that's what it's all about. It's about encouraging others, kind of similar to what John the Baptizer did. I must decrease that he might increase. He was the forerunner, and he kind of slipped back out of the way, and Christ came on with that. I'm not saying Chris, you're Christ, not saying Lyle's Christ, but I'm saying, let them move in a position of leadership. Let them do, because they can take the church further than what I could ever do. And they can do more than what I can do. And realize that there's nothing wrong with that. They're just gifted in different areas. And that's what it's all about, being a bishop.
So this will probably be the last thing we'll have time to answer based on our time. But it's very connected, very intertwined with what we were just talking about. This idea that everybody gets to play. Um, the first time I came into the church, I was, the group that you ran, and granted, like it was the national hub at that time too. So there was some different reasons for that. But one of the things I was struck by is like everybody had robes on, like everybody had some position. And coming from my background, I was like, what is this? Like, who are all these people? Why does everybody have like what struck me was this, especially as I leaned into it a little bit, the priesthood of believers, like everybody has a role, everybody has a gift to give the church. And that clergy laity divide that you sometimes see in a church, especially for a sacramental church, it just wasn't there in the same way. It was like everybody was kind of invited into that space, and I think a piece of that too is probably because there's kind of the broad policy of clergy within the Celtic Church don't get paid, and so there's this invitation of like, hey, I got a full-time job too. You gotta you gotta step up and do something. But I think it's bigger than just the time. There's an invitation that everybody gets to play. Could you talk?
There's one thing that I notice every church I go into, no matter what kind of church it is, and I don't like it. It's them rails in front of the pulpit, in front of the altar area. There's a rail there, and people can't go beyond that rail. I believe that church is demonstrating, without even saying a word, that you are the congregation, and you are going to do nothing but receive, and I'm going to do nothing but give. I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to do. I'm going to tell you how you're going to do it. But that's not how it should be. A church is a ecclesia. It's a called out group of believers that come together to demonstrate the love of Christ. As Christ was, so should we be as a church. And so we got to tear down that rail. And, we're so much more, we're not communities anymore. You know what I'm talking about? We're just not as community driven as what one day we were in times past. And I think that has almost destroyed a lot of churches. Most churches are aging out right now. When I say aging out, you'll find there's 100 people that are over the age of 75 or whatever it may be. You know what I'm saying? And there's not a lot of young people that are involved. And one thing about the Celtic Church is we want everybody to be involved. We want everybody to do something. You may not be able to get up in front of there and do the liturgy, but you can light the candles. You can bring in the Bible. You can open the scripture. You can read the scriptures. You can maybe lead a prayer. You can help us in our confession of faith. So there's things that people can do to be involved, and that's what makes a community. That's one thing I really noticed about Abbott McCrae's group in upstate New York. Yes, they all had their own homes, but when they come together with a purpose. If it was to help with the cows in the field or the garden, whatever it was, they came together with a purpose, and they all worked together. And it wasn't, well, you're not this or you're not that or that. No, and I think that's what I would strive to do, is to have everybody be involved. And it never bothered me to have everybody in clerical attire because everybody needs to have a part. Encourage people to take a part.
Since I brought it up, I'm gonna preempt any questions in this, the last couple minutes we have, and that may not be sufficient to answer the question. Why don't we pay our clergy? Why is that a blanket policy?
If there's ever been something that has so affected the religious Christianity itself, is the payment of clergy. It has made a difference between us and them. We're paid, it's our job. No, our job for everybody is to live that Christian faith, that, or we call it the Celtic faith, to live it. It's all of our jobs, not just the priests or not just the deacons. I think more wrong has been done. I will say this: if there is that ability for, Jesus told them not to worry about their, when they was going out, he sent them out 2 by 2. He said, don't worry about what you're going to do, how you're going to eat, what you're going to, when you're going to, he said, don't worry about those things. And sometimes that can be a hindrance in some sense, because we've got this concept in our minds that clergy is supposed to be paid, and it's up to us to pay. We got to tithe, we got to give so they can drive that BMW, that Cadillac. If you look at a lot of the religious groups, they've got to have these nice things, stuff like that, these nice suits and all this kind of stuff. No, that's not what it's about. It's about helping, encouraging, and so the whole community can be involved in that. And I think the pay part just causes too much problem. Now, somebody say, would there ever be a time where you might have somebody be paid for something? Well, there might be a need for that. Spiritual direction's a need. You need people that are gifted and trained in that area. There's nothing wrong there. What about running a homeless shelter? Yes, there's things that can be done. What about a children's home, an orphanage, a widow's home? How about a nursing home? All these things. So there's places for that can be that can serve a purpose. But I'm afraid so many times the money distracts and causes problems. I'll give you, for instance, I ain't gonna say where, but you can drive down the road and within 4 miles you'll have 15 churches. Most of these churches are barely running 15 to 25 people at the most. They're all paying for this preacher to stand in this pulpit and say his words and do his thing. Where if all those churches could come together under one roof and not have that burden, because it's a burden of these small groups to pay a pastor and keep the building up, pay this and do this, it would make a difference. So all I'm saying is, I think sometimes it's more of a hindrance. It distracts from what we're supposed to be doing. And the Celtic Church has always been that way. We believe in working. There's nothing wrong with working. Everybody needs to work, So people say, well, it is work, pastor in church. Well, yes and no. It's more of a ministry. It's just a way of taking our talents and abilities to accomplish what we've been called to do. So I've always, and the Celtic Church has always said, no, we're not going to pay our pastors. And a lot of people, when they find out that, they don't want to be a part of the Celtic Church because they're, well, if you ain't going to pay me, I ain't going to do that. I ain't going to pray for people if I ain't getting paid for it. It's sometimes you want to laugh because I know people say that. I've had them since when I was the bishop of the church and leading the church and say things like that. And, you just kind of, you might not say nothing to them, but you kind of think, oh boy, there's one of those. So, but it is a difference in it. It makes a difference.
Yeah.
But there are positions that are needed to be paid, as I pointed out. Children's homes, ministry things are actually a veteran center, maybe homeless shelters.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's not.
We're starting to lose you.
I'm starting to lose me.
Okay.
Sorry.
So if you could repeat the last sentence, maybe.
I believe sometimes it becomes an all to meet all type thing. And my dog's getting up here and wanting to have some fellowship. So down, Sasha, down.
Yeah.
Down. But anyway, I think it sometimes distracts more than it can be a help.
Yeah. And during my time, with the church, while I've been aware of the general policy that Celtic ministry is not paid for, and that has been true of my ministry within the Celtic Church, to add to your point, I worked at the children's home for a little while, and that was a paid ministry that I did while I was with the Celtic Church. And then the church I served up here in Indianapolis, the church paid me, and the Celtic Church was my ordaining supervising body and sent me on pulpit supply. And so I've served in full-time ministry. Spiritual direction was another one that you mentioned, and I currently charge for spiritual direction. And so there's room for paid ministry.
Yes.
To feed the teachers to some extent. But
Abbott McCrae would always say you got to feed the horse you rode in on.
Yeah, it's an interesting policy that really does shift. And I saw it when I was in the ministry role at at St. Andrews. That little group, when I was pastoring that group and it was unpaid, the help that I received from the community was so different from the help that I received when I was in paid pastoral roles. The engagement from the small church, and I've been blessed to serve in some really, really helpful churches, even in paid positions, but nothing compared to this tiny little group of people that was just like, yeah, we're all in, we'll do whatever you need. It was incredible. And I often in my mind attribute that to this, we know that we're in this together.
Right. I want to encourage anyone that sees this video to, if you've got questions, send them to Chris, and we'll discuss them. We'll talk about them. And, we may agree to disagree on things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's important that if you have questions, if you're even interested in the Apostolic Celtic Church that you might want to become a part of or learn more about, reach out, let Chris know. And there's people that'll get up with you, and some of the questions you ask, we may talk about the next time. So I encourage you.
Yeah. Bishop Ron, thank you for your time. For folks watching, thank you for your presence as we kind of went through this. And we will be back in another month. About a week before, I'll post it. It'll be on a Sunday again. I forget which Sunday of the month it is. Whatever Sunday of the month this is, it's that Sunday of the month every month, same time. And we're going to continue this conversation for a little bit. And hopefully people will find some real value out of it. I know that I have. So thanks so much, Ron. We appreciate you. Here is the end of our broadcast.